Racist police officer arrests black man. Turns out he's FBI. Snow fell silently over Riverside Park, coating the bare branches in crystalline white. Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench, his father's worn police badge pressed against his chest beneath his winter coat. The pages of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail rustled in his gloved hands, a book his father had given him before that fatal night 20 years ago. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins watched, his hand instinctively tightening on his holster. Something about the black man sitting alone in the snow stirred memories he'd rather forget, memories of promises broken and debts unpaid. Before we start, share where you're watching from. If you're new or haven't subscribed, please click subscribe. It means the world to us. Thanks. Marcus Davis carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had fought his battles in silence. At 42, his dark eyes held both wisdom and weariness, reflecting years of navigating a system that too often judged him by the color of his skin rather than the badge he carried. As an FBI agent, he'd earned the respect of his colleagues through unwavering dedication and exceptional instincts, traits inherited from his father, James Davis, a legendary black officer who died in the line of duty 2 decades ago. The worn police badge in his coat pocket was more than a memento. It was a reminder of his father's last words: "Change comes from within, son. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought with patience, not fury." The badge bore a small bloodstain, a permanent mark from the night James Davis made the ultimate sacrifice, saving a fellow officer's life in a drug bust gone wrong. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled with the rigid posture of a man carrying invisible wounds. At 54, his once proud shoulders now bore the weight of personal tragedy. The lines etched deeply around his eyes told stories of sleepless nights since his daughter Sarah's alleged assault 6 months ago, an incident that had twisted his once fair judgment into something darker. His wife's departure 3 months later, taking Sarah with her, had only deepened his bitterness. Yet beneath his hardened exterior lay the remnants of a decorated officer who had once been known for his fairness and dedication. 20 years of service had earned him commendations and respect, but recent months had seen complaints pile up on Captain Bennett's desk, all suggesting a pattern of racial profiling that couldn't be ignored. Captain Laura Bennett stood at her office window watching the snow blanket the city. At 45, she represented a new generation of leadership, determined to address the department's systemic issues. Her desk held 2 files, one detailing Brian's increasing complaints, the other containing the confidential history of James Davis's death. The connection between them weighed heavily on her conscience, a truth she knew would eventually surface. 3 lives intersecting in the winter stillness of Riverside Park, each carrying burdens invisible to the casual observer. Marcus holding his father's legacy close to his heart. Brian twisted by personal pain into someone he never meant to become. And Bennett tasked with maintaining justice while navigating the delicate balance between accountability and compassion. The snow continued to fall, nature's quiet reminder that beneath the surface, nothing is truly black or white. As Marcus turned another page in his book, and Brian's hand remained tensed on his holster, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force them all to confront truths long buried beneath decades of silence and snow. Winter had gripped the city with unusual ferocity that year. Riverside Park, normally bustling with life, stood nearly deserted under a thick blanket of snow, broken only by the occasional footprints of determined joggers and the laughter of a few children building snowmen near the playground. The bitter cold had driven most people indoors, making those who remained stand out like dark brushstrokes against a white canvas. The 27th Precinct, where Brian Harkins had served for over 2 decades, mirrored the tension in the air. Recent months had seen increasing protests outside its doors, with signs demanding accountability and reform. Inside, the halls echoed with whispered conversations about changing times and resistance to new policies. Photographs lined the walls, a visual timeline of the department's history, including one that Brian passed daily, a faded image of himself and James Davis at their academy graduation. both smiling with the optimism of young officers ready to change the world. The city itself was a study in contrasts. In the affluent areas near Riverside Park, winter brought ice skating and holiday decorations. But in the predominantly minority neighborhoods where Brian now focused most of his patrols, winter meant increased hardship and heightened police presence. These disparities hadn't gone unnoticed. Local newspapers had recently run exposes on racial profiling incidents, putting the department under intense scrutiny. Captain Bennett's office served as a crossroads between old and new. Her walls displayed both traditional police memorabilia and newly framed policies on diversity and inclusion. On her desk sat a proposal for mandatory bias training, a response to 7 discrimination complaints filed in the past month alone. 3 of these bore Brian's name, each incident more concerning than the last. The weather forecast predicted the heaviest snowfall in 20 years, the same span of time since James Davis's death. That night had also seen snow turning red with sacrifice beneath the harsh glare of police lights. The official report, buried deep in the precinct's archives, told one story. The truth, known only to a few, told another. Today's snow brought with it an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of Brian's boots as he patrolled and the distant sirens that seemed to echo the city's unrest. The few people in the park moved quickly, heads bowed against the cold, all except Marcus, who sat still as a statue, engrossed in his book. The scene could have been peaceful if not for the undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse through the frigid air. 3 children nearby worked on their snowman, their mixed races and easy laughter a stark contrast to the adult world around them. They represented what the city could be, what it should be. But as Brian's hand remained fixed on his holster, and Marcus turned another page of his father's book, the weight of history and prejudice hung heavy as the clouds above, threatening to bury more than just footprints in the gathering snow. The first snowflake that landed on Martin Luther King's words seemed to underscore their urgency. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Marcus brushed it away gently, his father's badge pressing against his chest with each breath. The children's laughter had faded as their parents hurried them home, leaving the park in ethereal silence. Brian Harkins watched the solitary figure on the bench, his mind clouded by memories of Sarah's tears 6 months ago. He was black, Dad, she'd sobbed, like the one sitting there now. His boots crunched through fresh snow as he approached, each step carrying the weight of personal vengeance masked as duty. Afternoon, Brian's voice cut through the winter air, sharp as ice. Park's closing soon. Marcus looked up, recognizing the look in the officer's eyes. He'd seen it countless times before. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "Stay calm, son. Your dignity is your shield." He carefully marked his page, movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "The sign says the park closes at 6, Officer," Marcus replied evenly. "It's only 4:30. Brian's jaw tightened at the precise, educated tone. It reminded him too much of the defense lawyer who'd suggested Sarah might be confused about her attacker. He demanded, hand still resting on his holster. The tension crackled like static in the frigid air. A few passers-by slowed their pace, phones discreetly emerging from pockets. Marcus felt the weight of the moment. How he handled the next few minutes could either diffuse or detonate an already volatile situation. "May I ask why you need my ID?" Officer Harkins, Marcus asked, noting the nameplate. His hand remained visible on his closed book. Brian stepped closer, snow crunching beneath his boots. "Because I said so," he growled. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." "Suspicious activity," Marcus repeated softly, like reading a book in a public park. Something in Marcus's calm demeanor further agitated Brian. The lack of fear, the quiet dignity, it felt like a challenge to his authority. Snow continued to fall around them, each flake adding to the mounting tension. Last warning, Brian's hand tightened on his holster. ID. Now. Marcus slowly reached into his coat, feeling his father's badge alongside his FBI credentials. A choice lay before him, one that could change everything. The weight of 20 years of history, unknown to both men, hung in the balance. As he withdrew his hand, a gust of wind scattered snow between them, momentarily blinding both men. When it cleared, Brian's weapon was drawn, and Marcus's calm facade cracked as he recognized something in the officer's stance, a ghost from his past he couldn't quite place. The park had gone completely silent, save for the soft whisper of falling snow and the quiet click of a safety being released. Hands where I can see them, Brian barked, weapon trained on Marcus. The winter air crystallized their breaths, creating halos around both men. Marcus's FBI credentials and his father's badge lay half withdrawn, concealed by his coat. Officer Harkins, Marcus spoke softly, fighting to maintain his composure. "You're making a mistake." On your knees, Brian's voice cracked with barely contained emotion. Sarah's tear-stained face flashed through his mind, clouding his judgment. The gathering crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, recording everything. Marcus slowly began to lower himself, snow seeping through his pants. His father's voice rang in his ears. Sometimes the greatest courage is in submission to injustice, so that justice may ultimately prevail. The badge pressed against his chest felt heavier than ever. A young black child watching from behind a tree called out. He didn't do anything wrong. His mother quickly pulled him back, whispering urgent warnings about staying quiet, staying safe. The scene painted a stark picture of inherited fear and learned silence. Brian roughly cuffed Marcus, the metal cold against bare skin. As he did so, something fell from Marcus's coat, the old badge, landing face up in the snow. Brian's hand froze for a split second, a fragment of recognition flickering across his face before being swallowed by his rage. "That's police property," he snarled, snatching it up and pocketing it without looking closely. "Add theft to the charges." Marcus felt a surge of anger, not for himself, but for his father's memory. "That badge belongs to me," he said, voice tight with controlled emotion. "It was my father's." "Sure it was," Brian scoffed, yanking Marcus to his feet. The MLK book fell into the snow, its pages fluttering in the winter wind. A teenage girl from the crowd darted forward to retrieve it, only to be warned back by Brian's harsh shout. As they moved toward the patrol car, Marcus noticed something odd about Brian's gait, a slight favor to his left leg, just like the officer his father had saved that snowy night 20 years ago. The realization hit him like an icy wave, but before he could speak, he was roughly pushed into the back seat. Through the window, Marcus watched the gathering crowd. Phones recorded, faces showed mixed expressions of anger, fear, and resignation. The young black child who had spoken out was crying into his mother's coat. The scene was a painful reminder that some things hadn't changed in 20 years. In the front seat, Brian's hand shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The badge in his pocket seemed to burn with accusation, but he refused to look at it. Not yet. Not until he had proven this man was lying, had to be lying, because the alternative would mean facing truths he wasn't ready to confront. The patrol car pulled away from Riverside Park, leaving behind a scene that would soon explode across social media: fresh snow, a discarded book, and dozens of witnesses to what would become a turning point for both men. If this story has touched you or sparked reflection about justice and human dignity, please consider showing your support with a like. Your engagement helps share these important conversations about bias, redemption, and the power of understanding. Together we can make a difference, one story at a time. The precinct's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Brian marched Marcus through the station. Officers paused mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort as they recognized something different about this arrest. The dignified bearing of the suspect, the trembling anger in Brian's movements, it all felt wrong. "Sit," Brian ordered, pushing Marcus toward the processing bench. Snow melted from their coats, creating small puddles on the linoleum floor. The confiscated badge weighed heavily in Brian's pocket, but pride kept him from examining it. Officer Jenny Chin, a rookie working the desk, glanced up from her computer. Her eyes widened slightly as she registered Marcus's appearance and demeanor. Charges, she asked, fingers hovering over her keyboard. Suspicious behavior, resisting arrest, possession of stolen police property, Brian rattled off, avoiding Marcus's steady gaze. I see Chin's voice carried a note of skepticism, and the probable cause for the initial stop. Before Brian could respond, Captain Bennett emerged from her office. The usual bustle of the precinct fell silent as she approached, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. Officer Harkins, she said, her tone carefully neutral. My office. Bring the suspect. As they walked, Marcus noticed a wall of fallen officers. His father's photograph, faded but dignified, watched their procession. He saw Brian's step falter slightly, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Inside Bennett's office, the captain settled behind her desk, studying both men intently. Officer Harkins, please remove those handcuffs. But Captain. Now. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus slowly brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists. Thank you, Captain Bennett, he said quietly. I believe Officer Harkins has something that belongs to me. Bennett's eyes flickered to Brian's pocket. The badge, Officer Harkins. Reluctantly, Brian withdrew the badge, finally looking at it properly. The blood stain on its surface, the familiar numbers, the date of issue, reality crashed over him like an icy wave. His hands began to shake. No, he whispered. It can't be. Badge number 7744, Marcus stated clearly. Issued to Officer James Davis, my father. The bloodstain came from the night he died saving his partner's life, his eyes locked with Brian's. A partner who walked with a slight limp afterward, just like you do, Officer Harkins. The color drained from Brian's face. He staggered slightly, catching himself on the edge of Bennett's desk. 20 years of buried memories surfaced the snowy night, the drug bust gone wrong, James pushing him out of the line of fire, the promise he'd made to a dying man. I didn't. I couldn't have known. Brian's voice cracked. Known what Marcus's voice remained steady, though his eyes blazed. That the black man you profiled was the son of the man who gave his life for yours, or that you were breaking the promise you made to him that night. Captain Bennett stood slowly. Officer Harkins, do you remember what you promised James Davis? Brian sank into a chair, the badge trembling in his hands. I promised. He swallowed hard. I promised I'd fight against the prejudices that almost got us both killed that night, that I'd never let color blind me to character. A promise you've broken today, Marcus said softly, and likely many times before. The office fell silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the distant sounds of the precinct. Outside, snow continued to fall as it had on that fatal night 20 years ago. Before anyone could speak further, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The door burst open, revealing a teenage girl with tears streaming down her face. Dad, Sarah Harkins cried, I have to tell you something. I can't let you do this anymore. Sarah Harkins stood trembling in the doorway, her winter coat dripping melted snow onto the office carpet. At 16, she bore the weight of a lie that had spiraled far beyond her control. Behind her, Brian's ex-wife Karen gripped their daughter's shoulders supportively. Sarah, what are you doing here? Brian rose, confusion and concern warring on his face. You should be at home resting. After what happened. Nothing happened. Dad, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. I lied. There was never any attack. The words hit Brian like physical blows. He staggered back, groping for his chair. What? I was dating Marcus, Sarah continued, tears flowing freely. Marcus Johnson. He's black, Dad. I knew how you'd react, so when you caught us together that night, I panicked. I said he attacked me because I was scared of your anger. Captain Bennett closed her eyes briefly, the pieces falling into place. Marcus Davis watched the scene unfold, his father's badge still lying on the desk between them, a silent witness to generational pain. 6 months, Brian whispered, his voice hollow. For 6 months I've become. He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Karen stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. This is why I left, Brian. Your hatred was poisoning our family. Sarah's been sick with guilt, watching what it's done to you. The complaints, Bennett interjected softly. The aggressive stops, the profiling, all stemming from a father's misplaced vengeance. Marcus stood silently, the weight of understanding settling over him. He picked up his father's badge, running his thumb over the bloodstain. 20 years ago, my father gave his life believing he was saving a good man, a man who promised to fight against the very prejudices that nearly killed them both that night. Brian's head snapped up, tears now streaming down his weathered face. James, he choked out. James would be ashamed of what I've become. Dad, Sarah moved closer, kneeling beside his chair. Marcus Johnson broke up with me because he was scared of you. Not because he was guilty, but because he saw what believing him guilty had done to you. He saw you changing. The office fell silent, save for the soft whir of the heating system fighting against the winter cold. Outside, the snow fell heavier, a curtain of white isolating this moment from the world beyond. I've destroyed everything, Brian whispered. My marriage, my daughter's trust, James's legacy, all because I couldn't face the truth about myself. Marcus stepped forward, his father's badge catching the fluorescent light. Officer Harkins, he said quietly, my father believed that redemption is always possible, but it requires the courage to face our darkest truths. Captain Bennett moved to her window, watching the snow blanket the city. The question now, she said, is what we do with these truths. The tension in the room was broken by a quiet ping from Bennett's computer. Her face tightened as she read the incoming message. The video of the arrest has gone viral. Social media is exploding. We're about to have a situation on our hands. Brian looked up, his face etched with the horror of realization. His personal tragedy had become public spectacle. His daughter's tears, his ex-wife's presence, Marcus Davis's quiet dignity, all of it now stood against the backdrop of his most shameful moment. And somewhere in the precinct archives, a 20-year-old case file held secrets that were about to surface, threatening to unravel more than just one officer's career. The Internal Affairs investigation room felt colder than the winter storm raging outside. Detective Michael Rivera, a veteran investigator known for his methodical approach, spread photographs from the park incident across the steel table. Security camera stills, cell phone footage screenshots, and witness photos created a damning timeline. Let's review what we have, Rivera began, his voice professionally detached. The room's occupants, Captain Bennett, 2 Iowa officers, and a precinct lawyer leaned forward. Marcus Davis had declined to press immediate charges, but the viral nature of the incident demanded investigation. 17 witness statements. Rivera pointed to a stack of papers, 12 video recordings from different angles, body cam footage from Officer Harkins, park security feeds, and this, he placed the blood-stained badge in the center of the table, a piece of history that changes everything. The body cam footage played on the wall screen. Brian's heavy breathing, the tremor in his voice, the unnecessary escalation, all captured in high definition. But it was the background details that painted the fuller picture, the children watching in fear, the MLK book lying in the snow the moment the badge fell. What troubles me most, Rivera continued, isn't just today's incident. It's the pattern. He opened a thick file. 6 months ago, Officer Harkins' complaint record was spotless. Then suddenly 15 complaints of racial profiling, all following his daughter's alleged assault that we now know never happened. Captain Bennett rubbed her temples. The daughter's false report, do we have that on record now? Full written confession, Rivera confirmed. Sarah Harkins came forward voluntarily, accompanied by her mother. The psychological evaluation suggests she's been carrying this guilt for months. The precinct lawyer, Sandra Martinez, spoke up. "We have a bigger problem. I've been digging into the James Davis case from 20 years ago. The official report doesn't match witness statements from that night." A heavy silence fell over the room. Bennett's expression tightened. "Explain." Martinez pulled out an aged case file. According to the official report, Officer James Davis died heroically saving his partner during a drug bust. Simple, clean narrative. But witness statements suggest there was more. There were allegations of a setup. Claims that certain officers had tipped off the drug dealers. Those statements never made it into the final report. Rivera's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting the bust was compromised?" "I'm suggesting Martinez chose her words carefully. That officer, Brian Harkins, might not be the only one who failed to keep his promise to James Davis that night." The implications hung heavy in the air. Bennett moved to the window, watching snow swirl in the parking lot lights. Who was in charge of the investigation back then? "That's the interesting part," Martinez replied. "Captain Richard Wells, your predecessor, and Brian Harkins, former training officer." Security footage from the current incident played silently on the wall. In it, Marcus Davis maintained his dignity even as he was wrongfully arrested, his father's badge falling into snow that looked just like it had 20 years ago. "There's more," Rivera added, pulling out another file. "I've been reviewing Officer Harkins' cases from the past 6 months. 3 arrests with questionable probable cause, all involving young black men. All 3 cases were fast-tracked for prosecution by the same DA office that buried the questionable witness statements 20 years ago." Bennett turned from the window, her face set with determination. "So what you're telling me is that we're not just investigating one incident of racial profiling. We're looking at a potential decades-old cover-up that's poisoned this department's culture and corrupted at least one good officer's moral compass. And now it's all coming to light," Martinez added, "because a teenage girl couldn't bear the weight of a lie, and a son carried his father's badge into the wrong park at the right time." Rivera gathered the photos slowly. "The media's already calling this the badge in the snow incident. Social justice organizations are demanding answers, but they don't know the half of it." "What do you recommend?" Bennett asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We go deep," Rivera replied firmly. "Full investigation, not just of today's incident, but of everything. The Davis case, the buried statements, the pattern of profiling, the DA's involvement. All of it. That could take down half the department's old guard," Martinez warned. "Maybe it needs to," Bennett responded, picking up James Davis's badge. "Sometimes the only way to honor a sacrifice is to finish what they started." Outside the investigation room, Brian Harkins sat alone in the precinct break room, staring at his reflection in a cold cup of coffee. Down the hall, Sarah was still giving her statement, laying bare the lie that had twisted her father into someone she no longer recognized. And somewhere in the city, Marcus Davis stood at his father's grave, snow gathering on his shoulders, wondering if today's pain might finally lead to the justice his father died believing in. The investigation was just beginning, but like the winter storm outside, it promised to leave nothing unchanged in its wake. At home that evening, Brian Harkins sat in his darkened living room, surrounded by the ghosts of his former life. Family photos on the walls traced his transformation, the proud academy graduate standing beside James Davis, the happy family portraits that grew progressively tenser over the years, until they stopped altogether 6 months ago. His hands trembled as he opened a dusty box he'd kept locked in his closet for 20 years. Inside lay newspaper clippings about James Davis's death, a bloodied uniform piece he couldn't bear to throw away, and a sealed letter, James's final words, never opened. "I couldn't read it," he whispered to the empty room. Couldn't face your last request, could I, James? Across town, Marcus sat in his father's old study, now his own. The walls held both their badges, his FBI credentials, beside the empty space where his father's badge usually hung. A framed photo showed young Marcus at his father's police graduation, sitting atop broad shoulders, both beaming with pride. "You were right, Dad," Marcus spoke softly, picking up a worn journal. "Change does come from within." He opened the journal, his father's familiar handwriting filling the pages with observations about his partner, Brian Harkins. "Brian's a good man fighting old prejudices. Sometimes I see him catch himself, question his first reactions. That's where hope lives, in those moments of self-doubt. If we can nurture that, maybe we can change things from the inside." Meanwhile, Sarah Harkins huddled on her bed at her mother's house, her own journal open before her. The pages chronicled her relationship with Marcus Johnson, her fear of her father's reaction, and the devastating lie that followed. "Dad's face when he saw us together, I'd never seen him so angry." Marcus just stood there, calm, trying to explain. But Dad wouldn't listen. "I saw something break in him that night. The lie came so easily, but I didn't know it would destroy him like this." Karen, Brian's ex-wife, sat at her kitchen table reviewing divorce papers. Her hands paused over a photo album showing happier times Brian coaching Sarah's soccer team, family picnics, moments before the change. A letter from Sarah's therapist lay nearby, detailing the psychological toll of maintaining the lie that had torn their family apart. Back at the precinct, Captain Bennett worked late, piecing together connections. Her computer screen displayed personnel files: James Davis, Brian Harkins, and her predecessor, Captain Wells. A pattern emerged: cases of possible racial profiling quietly buried, officers who spoke up mysteriously transferred, and through it all, Wells's influence protecting the old guard. Her phone buzzed a text from her brother, a civil rights attorney. "The Davis case files you sent. This goes deeper than we thought. The drug bust that night, it wasn't random. Someone wanted James Davis gone." In his sparse apartment, Detective Rivera spread case files across his dining table. 20 years of investigations connected by invisible threads: James Davis's death, Wells's rise to power, Brian's transformation, and now, this moment of reckoning. His whiteboard held a web of names, dates, and questions, with one photo at the center: James Davis and Brian Harkins at their graduation. Snow continued to fall outside all their windows, blanketing the city in silence. In their separate spaces, each person held pieces of a truth too heavy to bear alone. Brian finally breaking the seal on James's letter, his tears falling on words written 2 decades ago: "Watch out for my boy, Brian. Show him a better world than the one that tried to kill us tonight." Marcus reading his father's final journal entry: "If anything happens to me, the truth is in the badge. Brian will understand when the time comes." Sarah writing in her tear-stained diary: "I thought I was protecting myself, but I helped create the very thing I feared most in my father." Karen finding an old photo of Brian and James that showed something crucial in the background: a figure watching them with evident malice, a younger Captain Wells. Bennett discovering an encrypted file on the precinct's old server: Davis investigation, eyes only, with a list of names still active in the department. Rivera connecting final dots that painted a picture of conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of city government. The snow fell heavier now, as if trying to bury these emerging truths beneath its clean white surface. But like the bloodstain on James Davis's badge, some marks couldn't be covered, some truths couldn't be hidden, and some promises broken or kept would demand their reckoning. In the distance, church bells tolled midnight. A new day was coming, carrying with it the weight of 20 years of secrets, lies, and silence. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one building within the hearts of those touched by this unfolding story of justice delayed but perhaps not denied. The departmental hearing room was packed to capacity despite the blizzard conditions outside. Snow battered the windows as Captain Bennett called the session to order. The air felt electric with tension as Brian Harkins sat alone at the respondent's table, his uniform pressed but his shoulders slumped. Across the aisle, Marcus Davis sat with Detective Rivera, their table laden with evidence files. The viral video of the arrest played silently on wall screens, a constant reminder of what had brought them here. In the gallery, Sarah Harkins sat between her mother and Marcus Johnson, their presence both support and accusation. This hearing, Bennett began, her voice carrying through the hushed room, will address not only the events in Riverside Park, but also evidence that has come to light regarding a 20-year-old case that appears to be intimately connected. Brian's head snapped up at this. They hadn't warned him about the expanded scope. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him. Detective Rivera Bennett nodded. Please present your findings. Rivera stood, his weathered face grave. What began as an investigation into racial profiling has revealed a pattern of institutional corruption spanning 2 decades. He activated a presentation screen. It begins with the death of Officer James Davis. The room stirred as James's academy photo appeared. Brian's hands began to shake as Rivera continued. Official reports state Officer Davis died heroically saving his partner, Officer Harkins, during a drug bust. However, newly uncovered evidence suggests the bust was a setup orchestrated by officers who saw Davis as a threat to their status quo. Rivera played enhanced audio from Brian's body camera during Marcus's arrest. Sometimes the greatest courage is in submission to injustice, so that justice may ultimately prevail. These words, Rivera explained, were James Davis's last words to his partner. Words Officer Harkins would have recognized had he not allowed prejudice to blind him to who stood before him that day. Brian's lawyer stood. Objection. This is supposed to be about the park incident, not ancient history. The connection is relevant, Bennett ruled. Continue, Detective. Rivera produced James's badge. This badge carries more than a blood stain. Microscopic engravings inside contain names, dates, and evidence of systematic corruption. James Davis knew he was being targeted. He left this evidence for his son to find, trusting his partner would help protect Marcus when the time came. The room erupted in murmurs. Brian stared at the badge, memories flooding back, James pressing it into his hands that snowy night, whispering about proof hidden where only the right eyes would see it. Instead, Rivera continued, Officer Harkins allowed personal tragedy, a false accusation born of fear and prejudice, to transform him into everything his partner fought against. Sarah's quiet sobs could be heard in the silence that followed. Brian couldn't bring himself to look at her. But there's more, Rivera announced. Captain Wells, Officer Harkins' former training officer, appears to have been orchestrating racial profiling incidents for years, using officers' personal biases to advance an agenda of systematic discrimination. Evidence flashed across the screens: buried complaints, altered reports, suspicious transfers of officers who spoke up. And through it all, a pattern emerged of Wells protecting certain officers while punishing others. The park incident, Rivera concluded, was not isolated. It was the inevitable result of 20 years of buried truths and broken promises. Brian stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. I need to speak, he said, his voice raw. Bennett nodded, and the room held its breath. James Davis was more than my partner, Brian began, tears now flowing freely. He was my conscience. When he died, he made me promise 2 things: to protect his son and to fight the prejudices that got him killed. He turned to face Marcus. I failed at both. He pulled out James's unopened letter. I couldn't read this for 20 years. Couldn't face his final words. But last night his voice broke. Last night I finally did. Brian began reading, brother, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But the fight isn't over. They're coming for me because I wouldn't stay quiet about the corruption, the profiling, and the abuse of power. The proof is in the badge, proof that could change everything. Protect Marcus. Show him a better world than the one that killed me. Don't let him win by becoming what we fought against." The room was absolutely silent now, every eye fixed on Brian as he continued. "I didn't just fail James," he said, looking at his daughter. "I failed everyone. My hatred destroyed my family, betrayed my partner's memory, and nearly ruined an innocent man's life. All because I couldn't face my own prejudices." Marcus stood slowly. "Officer Harkins," he said quietly, "my father believed in redemption. He believed one person's courage to face the truth could change everything." He paused, holding up his father's journal. "The question is, do you have that courage now?" The weight of the moment hung in the air, snow still falling outside as Brian Harkins faced the choice that would define not just his future, but the future of the department itself. As he opened his mouth to respond, the hearing room doors burst open. Every head turned to see Captain Wells himself stride in, flanked by internal affairs officers. "This hearing is now suspended," Wells announced. "New evidence has come to light that changes everything." "New evidence," Bennett challenged, rising from her seat. But Wells wasn't looking at her. His cold eyes were fixed on Brian Harkins. "Tell him," Brian Wells commanded. "Tell him who really killed James Davis that night." The room froze. Brian's face went ashen as Wells approached, pulling out an old police file. "You see," Wells continued, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "Officer Harkins here didn't just witness his partner's death. He fired the shot that killed him." Gasps filled the room. Marcus half rose from his chair, but Rivera's hand on his shoulder kept him seated. "That's not true," Brian whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands trembled as memories of that snowy night flooded back the chaos, the gunfire, the blood on his hands. Wells smiled coldly. "The ballistics report was very clear. The bullet that killed James Davis came from your gun, Brian. I helped cover it up because you were a promising officer, because you promised to uphold certain traditions in the department." Sarah's voice cut through the tension, "Dad." Brian's world spun. The truth he'd buried beneath layers of guilt and prejudice clawed its way to the surface. It wasn't. "I didn't mean," he stammered. But Marcus had risen, his father's journal open. "You're both lying," he said quietly, "and I can prove it." He walked to the evidence screen, plugging in a USB drive. My father's final journal entry, written the morning he died, the handwriting appeared on screen. "Wells ordered me to participate in a staged drug bust tonight. Says it's a test of loyalty. But I've gathered enough evidence of his corruption. The badge carries the truth. If anything happens, the bullet will tell it's marked. Brian's gun was tampered with. They're planning to." The entry ended abruptly. Marcus turned to Wells, whose smug expression had faltered. "You didn't know about the journal, did you? Or that my father marked his bullets with microscopic engravings that night?" Rivera stepped forward, producing a sealed evidence bag. "The bullet that killed James Davis, we had it re-examined yesterday. It carries Wells's badge number, not Brian's." Wells lunged for the door, but internal affairs officers were faster. As they handcuffed him, he snarled it was for the greater good. Davis was going to destroy everything we'd built. But Brian hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the journal entry, tears streaming down his face. All these years I thought I'd accidentally shot him. Wells told me my gun had misfired in the chaos, the guilt. It ate at me until I couldn't feel anything else." Marcus approached him slowly. "My father knew they were going to frame you. That's why he marked everything: the bullet, the badge, his journal. He was protecting his partner until the end." Sarah rushed to her father, embracing him as he broke down completely. 20 years, Brian sobbed. 20 years of hating myself, hating others, letting that guilt poison everything. Captain Bennett's voice cut through the emotional scene. "Officer Harkins wasn't just a victim of Wells's corruption. He was its prime target. Wells used his guilt, manipulated his pain, turned him into exactly what James Davis fought against. As Wells was led away, still shouting justifications, Marcus stood before Brian. The room waited, breath held for his response to these revelations. "Officer Harkins," Marcus said softly, "my father's last words to me were about forgiveness. Son," he said, "sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself." Brian looked up through tears. "How can you even consider forgiveness? After everything I've done?" Marcus held out his father's badge. Because this badge represents more than just law enforcement. It represents the belief that change is possible, that justice and mercy can coexist. But the snow outside had stopped, weak winter sunlight breaking through the clouds, but the real darkness, 20 years of lies and manipulation, was finally lifting. "There's one more thing," Rivera announced, producing another document. James Davis left a will. In it, he asked that if anything happened to him, his badge should be given to two people, his son and his partner, to remind them that the greatest partnerships bridge all divides. Brian stared at the badge in Marcus's outstretched hand, seeing for the first time the tiny engravings along its edge: truth, justice, brotherhood. As he reached for it, Sarah still holding him tight, the room understood they were witnessing more than just the resolution of an old case. They were seeing the beginning of real change, born from the ashes of decades of pain and deception. As this emotional journey unfolds, I invite you to join our community by subscribing. Every subscription supports stories that illuminate the complexity of human nature, justice, and redemption. Together, we can explore more powerful narratives that challenge our perspectives and touch our hearts. Your support matters. The aftermath of the hearing hit like an avalanche. Brian sat in his empty kitchen, surrounded by packed boxes and fading memories. Sarah's college acceptance letter lay unopened on the counter, her path to a fresh start at Berkeley, far from the shadow of her father's disgrace. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters seeking comments about the corrupted badge scandal, as the media had dubbed it. The revelation of Wells's manipulation had spared him criminal charges, but the weight of his actions remained. 15 officers had been suspended pending investigation, and decades of cases were being reviewed. Dad, Sarah stood in the doorway, snow melting from her boots. Her face, so like her mother's, carried a mix of pain and hope. "The movers are here for my stuff." Brian nodded, unable to speak. His daughter was leaving not just for college, but leaving the toxic environment his prejudices had created. Karen had agreed to let him help with tuition. It felt like blood money. Marcus Johnson called Sarah, said softly, "He's doing well in medical school. Says he forgives me for the lie." She paused, tears welling. "Why is it harder to forgive ourselves, Dad?" The question hung in the air like frost. Brian fingered the resignation letter in his pocket, his last official act as a police officer. Though cleared of James's death, his documented pattern of racial profiling made his position untenable. "Your father was a good man who lost his way." Karen's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. "The question is, what kind of man will you choose to be now?" The television droned in the background. Breaking news: federal investigation expands as evidence suggests corrupt officers may have influenced cases across 3 states. Former Captain Wells faces additional charges. Brian stood, moving to help Sarah with her boxes. Each one felt like it contained pieces of his failure as a father. Designer clothes bought with guilt money. Photos from happier times before he let hatred corrupt his soul. Her childhood teddy bear, won at a fair when he was still the kind of father who took his family to fairs. "I found this," Sarah said quietly, pulling out an old photograph. It showed Brian and James Davis at a department picnic, their families together, children playing. Marcus and Sarah, barely toddlers, sharing a swing set. "We could have been friends our whole lives, couldn't we? If fear hadn't gotten in the way." Brian took the photo with trembling hands. In it, His younger self smiled without shadows in his eyes. James stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, as if anchoring him to better angels he'd later abandon. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether to the photo, his daughter, or his own lost self, he wasn't sure. Outside, moving men carried boxes of Sarah's childhood to a waiting truck. Each trip up and down the stairs marked another piece of his life being packed away, leaving him alone with his regrets in a house that no longer felt like home. The national media descended on the city like winter crows. CNN's headline screamed systemic racism exposed how one badge revealed 20 years of police corruption. Fox News countered with police department in crisis, how far is too far in reform. Outside the precinct, protesters braved the bitter cold, their breath frosting in the air as they chanted for justice. Counter-protesters gathered across the street defending the old guard of law enforcement. Between them, a thin line of officers stood uncomfortably, many questioning their own roles in the system. Captain Bennett faced a wall of cameras, her composure steady despite the chaos. "The badge in the snow incident didn't create these problems," she stated firmly. "It simply exposed what was already there. Now we have a choice: continue hiding from these truths or face them honestly and commit to real change." Inside the precinct, resignations piled up on Bennett's desk. 5 senior officers quit rather than face investigation. Younger officers struggled with the revelation that their mentors had perpetuated a system of discrimination. The city council held emergency sessions. The mayor, sweating under bright lights, announced a complete review of police practices. Civil rights attorneys filed class action lawsuits. The FBI expanded its investigation into other departments, fearing similar patterns of corruption. Local newspapers published stories of past victims, people whose lives were derailed by racially motivated arrests. Their faces stared out from front pages, each one a testament to the human cost of systemic prejudice. In coffee shops and diners, conversations turned heated. "They're destroying the whole department over one incident." No, they're finally facing the truth about thousands of incidents. But who'll protect us if good officers keep quitting? Were they really good officers if they participated in this? The snow continued falling as if trying to cover the city's exposed wounds. But like the bloodstain on James Davis's badge, some marks couldn't be erased by winter's whiteness. A political cartoon captured the moment a police badge half buried in snow, its reflection in the ice showing decades of hidden injustice. It went viral, shared millions of times with the hashtag #BadgeAin'tTheSnow. Sarah's school paper published her anonymous account, "My Lie," and its consequences. It was picked up by national media, adding another layer to the unfolding tragedy, how fear and prejudice poison even the youngest hearts. Marcus Davis received hundreds of interview requests. He declined them all, instead writing a single op-ed for the local paper, "My Father's Badge, a Legacy of Hope." The piece ended with James Davis's own words, "Change comes from within, but healing happens together." As winter tightened its grip on the city, the implications of the scandal spread like cracks in ice. No one could predict how deep the investigation would go, how many careers would end, how many lives would change. But beneath the media frenzy and political posturing, 2 families remained at the heart of the storm, their personal pain, both a catalyst for change and a reminder of its cost. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Hidden in Captain Wells's personal safe, Detective Rivera found a weathered envelope addressed to both Brian Harkins and Marcus Davis, dated the day before James Davis died. The precinct conference room was silent as Marcus opened it with trembling hands, Brian sitting across the table. Inside lay a single photograph and a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, Marcus, read aloud, then the truth about that night isn't what either of you believe." The photograph showed 3 men: James Davis, Brian Harkins, and Wells, but there was a 4th figure, deliberately blurred in the background. The note continued, "The corruption goes higher than the department. The person who ordered my death wasn't Wells, he was just following orders. The real mastermind was the man who raised you, Marcus. Your Uncle Richard Davis, the current police commissioner." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus stared at the note in disbelief. "No, that's impossible. Uncle Richard practically raised me after Dad died." Brian leaned forward, realization dawning. That's why he pushed so hard for you to join law enforcement, why he mentored your career. To keep you close Rivera finished, to make sure you never discovered the truth. Marcus's world tilted. Every Sunday dinner, every piece of career advice, every proud smile at his accomplishments, all orchestrated by the man who ordered his father's death. "There's more," Brian said softly, studying the photo. The timestamp. This was taken the morning of the drug bust. James knew he was going to die. He planned everything: the marked bullet, the evidence in the badge, even Wells's eventual confession. "But why?" Marcus whispered. "Why would my uncle?" The answer came from Karen, who burst into the room clutching old newspaper archives. "Because your father discovered something bigger than police corruption. Look at these development contracts from 20 years ago. The drug zones where aggressive policing was concentrated, they all became luxury developments within 5 years. Gentrification through criminalization," Rivera muttered. "Framed the neighborhoods as high crime areas. Forced property values down," Brian continued. "Then buy everything at pennies on the dollar," Marcus finished, bile rising in his throat. "My uncle's real estate empire, built on manufactured crime statistics and false arrests." The snow outside had turned to freezing rain, drumming against the windows like accusatory fingers. Marcus stood abruptly, heading for the door. "Where are you going?" Brian asked, though he already knew. "To Sunday dinner," Marcus replied, his voice hard as ice. "Uncle Richard never misses tradition." "Not alone," Brian said, standing. "Your father saved my life. Let me help save his legacy." As they moved to leave, Karen caught Brian's arm. "There's one more thing. Sarah's accident last month, the brake lines were cut." Brian's face went pale. "You mean?" "Your daughter's not just leaving for college," Rivera said grimly. "She's been in witness protection this whole time. They knew she was ready to tell the truth. About everything." The drive to Police Commissioner Richard Davis's mansion felt like traversing through time. Snow whirled around Brian's car as Marcus sat silently in the passenger seat, his father's badge clutched tightly in his hand. Family photos from his wallet lay scattered on the dashboard, decades of manufactured memories, Sunday dinners built on lies. "All those times he comforted me about Dad's death," Marcus whispered, his breath fogging the window. He sat there playing the grieving brother, knowing he'd ordered the hit. Brian gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Just like Wells manipulated my guilt. They used our pain against us, kept us blind with grief and prejudice." Through the storm, the mansion's lights glowed like false beacons. Richard Davis's annual Sunday dinner, a tradition that had kept the family close, kept secrets buried, kept control intact. "You know what my father wrote in his last journal entry?" Marcus said suddenly. He said, "The hardest chains to break are the ones we think are protecting us." Inside the mansion, Richard Davis prepared for dinner as usual. His housekeeper had set the table for 3 himself, Marcus and Brian, whose unexpected acceptance of the dinner invitation had raised no suspicion. After all, a broken man seeking redemption was easy to manipulate. But as the doorbell rang, Richard Davis didn't see 2 broken men. He saw his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. "Uncle Richard," Marcus said, embracing him with newfound awareness of the poison beneath the warmth. "Thank you for including Officer Harkins tonight." "Family forgives," Richard replied smoothly. "And after recent revelations, we need healing more than ever." They sat down to dinner, snow falling outside like nature's own surveillance, covering tracks, burying truths. The housekeeper served soup, James's favorite recipe. Richard remembered aloud, ever the caring brother?" "Yes," Marcus agreed, touching his father's badge in his pocket. "Dad always said food brings people together, makes them let their guard down." Richard's spoon paused halfway to his lips, something in Marcus's tone. He also believed Brian added quietly that the truth has a way of rising to the surface. "Like bodies in water, right, Commissioner?" The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the sudden silence. Outside, unmarked cars quietly surrounded the mansion. Inside, decades of lies hung suspended between spoonfuls of soup. Richard Davis set down his spoon, his mask of benevolence cracking just slightly. "I always tried to protect you, Marcus. Everything I did was to make you stronger." "No," Marcus replied, placing his father's badge on the table. "Everything you did was to protect yourself. But Dad knew, didn't he? That's why he marked the bullet that killed him with your initials, not Wells's." Richard's eyes darted to the windows, seeing the gathering shadows outside. His hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Brian warned. "Sarah's safe. Your reach ends tonight." As federal agents breached the mansion's quiet dignity, snow continued falling, covering the city in clean white truth. Sometimes transformation comes not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments over soup, when lies finally lose their power to bind. Spring came early that year, melting away the last traces of winter's heaviest snow. Outside the courthouse, cherry blossoms drifted on the breeze as Richard Davis was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case had exposed decades of corruption, leading to reforms across multiple police departments nationwide. Marcus stood at his father's grave, the morning sun warming the newly placed plaque that told the full story of James Davis's sacrifice. Behind him, footsteps crunched on gravel. Brian Harkins, walking with his daughter Sarah for the first time since she'd emerged from witness protection. The cherry blossoms were his favorite, Marcus said without turning. He said they reminded him that beautiful things can grow from dark places. Sarah stepped forward, placing a small bouquet against the headstone. She'd cut her hair short, dyed it brown, remnants of her time in hiding. "I used to be so angry," she said softly. "At you, Dad, at myself. But now I understand what Officer Davis meant about change coming from within." Brian touched the grave marker gently. His police uniform was gone, replaced by the casual clothes of his new life. He'd accepted a position teaching ethics and bias awareness at the police academy, using his own story as a cautionary tale. "James knew," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. "He knew that saving my life that night meant more than just taking a bullet. He was saving me from becoming what I almost became." Marcus opened his father's journal to its final pages. "Listen to this," he said. "Today I saw Brian stop himself from making a prejudiced assumption. He caught himself, questioned his thinking. In that moment I saw hope. Real change isn't in grand gestures, it's in these small victories over our own darker nature." Sarah wiped away tears. "That's why you forgave us, isn't it? Because your father believed in those small victories." Marcus nodded, closing the journal. The badge in the snow wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a reminder that we all have choices. Every day we choose what kind of person we want to be. A cherry blossom landed on the grave marker, pink against gray stone. Brian pulled out his resignation letter from the police force. He'd kept it as a reminder. "I'm speaking at the academy next week," he said. "About that day in the park, about your father, about everything. Would you both come?" Sarah took her father's hand. Marcus looked at them both, seeing not the officer who'd arrested him or the girl whose lie had sparked it all, but two people choosing to be better than their past mistakes. "James Davis didn't die just to expose corruption," Marcus said. "He died believing that people can change, that understanding can replace fear. The least we can do is prove him right." Together they stood as more cherry blossoms fell, nature's gentle reminder that after the hardest winter, spring always returns. And with it comes the chance for new growth, new understanding, and the small victories that, day by day, change the world. 1 year later, snow fell again on Riverside Park. This time Marcus Davis sat on the same bench, but he wasn't alone. Brian Harkins sat beside him, both men watching Sarah teach a diverse group of children about police work as part of their new community outreach program. Hard to believe it's been a year, Brian said, watching his daughter demonstrate proper badge pinning technique to an enthusiastic young black girl. Sometimes I still wake up thinking it was all a dream. Marcus opened his father's journal, now published as part of the Police Academy's reformed training curriculum. Dad wrote something about dreams. Here, the dream isn't a perfect world. The dream is a world where we face our imperfections honestly. The Police Academy had been transformed. Brian's ethics classes were mandatory, with officers from across the country coming to learn from the badge in the snow case. Sarah, now in her second year at Berkeley, had started a nationwide program connecting police officers' children with families in minority communities. "Look," Sarah called out, waving them over. The children had built 2 snowmen, one wearing a toy police badge, the other in a junior FBI vest. Between them, they'd placed a sign, "Heroes come in all colors." Brian felt tears freeze on his cheeks. James would have loved this. "He does," Marcus replied softly. "Every time one of your students chooses understanding over fear, every time Sarah's program brings 2 families together, every time these kids see a future where badges mean protection, not prejudice, he sees it all." Snow began falling harder, but none of them moved to leave. The children played, their laughter carrying across the park where, 1 year ago, hatred and fear had nearly destroyed 2 families. Now those same families were building something new from the ashes of the past. Sarah joined them on the bench, snow dusting her hair. "The girl with the badge," she said, "that's Marcus Johnson's little sister. She wants to be a police officer like Mr. Harkins, who teaches love instead of fear." The 3 sat together, watching the future play out before them in the form of children who saw no barriers between themselves. Above them, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows that merged and blended, indistinguishable from each other. Marcus pulled out his father's badge, now displayed in the Academy's Hall of Honor alongside Brian's Ethics Teaching Award. The bloodstain had been preserved under glass, a permanent reminder that some stains can become sacred if they lead to healing. "To small victories," Brian said quietly. "To honest change," Sarah added. "To James Davis," Marcus finished, "who saw the best in us, even when we couldn't see it ourselves." As evening fell, the children's parents arrived, greeting each other with the warmth of a community that had learned to look past surface differences. The snow continued falling, no longer hiding painful truths but blanketing the world in possibilities. Sometimes the greatest change comes not in moments of dramatic revelation, but in quiet afternoons when former enemies share a bench, watching their legacy of healing play out in the laughter of children in the snow. The end. If this story of redemption, justice, and human transformation has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to support more meaningful narratives like this. Your like and share can help spread these important messages about overcoming prejudice and the power of forgiveness. We'd love to hear your thoughts and what lessons resonated with you in the comments below. From our hearts to yours, we thank you deeply for being part of this storytelling journey together. Your engagement makes these stories of hope and healing possible.